Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Frederik Buylaert. I'm a member of Ghent's History Department and also the PI of the ERC Starting Grant Project State. From the outset, I must stress that the project is still in its early stages. We only started a year ago, so I'll not present any preliminary data or conclusions. Rather, I'll focus on the central question of the project and what the historiographical stakes of the project are. My project is concerned with the rise of the state in Western Europe in the late Middle Age, early modern era. And the $1.5 million question of the project is whether state formation must be imagined as a process that combines centralization and decentralization. Ever since Max Weber famously defined the modern state as an institution with a monopoly on legitimate violence within a given territory, historians tend to imagine the rise of the state as a process of centralization. And the 14th, 15th and 16th century are always imagined to be central stage in this development. It is in this period that we see the rise of strong central states and also the establishment of new fiscal systems that allow princes, kings and so on to pay for those new armies. Also a lot of new state institutions such as parliaments emerge in the late Middle Ages. The hypothesis of my project is very simple, namely that the paradigm is incomplete. I think to this day that we have insufficiently investigated the possibility that pre-modern states also heavily relied on decentralization next to centralization to gain strength. Paradoxically, I think princes could also gain a lot of support for the rise of the state by delegating authority to local elites. And since the 1990s, historians are aware of this possibility, but so far we have found it very, very difficult to measure the importance of decentralization as a factor in state formation. For me, the central concept that I deploy to measure decentralization, the selective decentralization of authority, is the establishment of new lordships. In a lordship, the public authority over a village, or sometimes a town, was not the prerogative of the state, but of a private individual, the local lord, who rules over the village, who owns that power as a private property. For example, when a lord dies, his power does not return to the state, no, it just falls to his heir, who can continue to rule the village. I suppose you all watch Game of Thrones, so I think you all can imagine what lordship is, what lords do. What matters to me is, however, that lordships, because they are exceptions to the state's monopoly on the use of violence within the territory, they can be imagined as kind of small states within the state. Consider, for example, what happened in the Flemish village of Halsbeek in the 15th century, where a man was burned at the stake by his local lord. What is interesting about this rather gruesome example is that the situation is not a medieval relic. If this poor man had been sentenced in the 14th century, his trial would have been conducted for judges appointed by the state. It is only in the 15th century that it was the local lord who acquired the power to speak a sentence over an inhabitant of his village. It was in the 15th century that the rulers of the Low Countries needed to reward a local nobleman by granting him the authority over the villagers of Halsbeek as kind of a boon in return for military support. And this example fits into a much broader pattern. As a preliminary test of the hypothesis of my project, we have made a survey of the evolution of lordship in Flanders. And the test is successful as it reveals that the rise of a strong state in late medieval Flanders tends to reinforce lordship rather than to destroy it. The number of lordships in Flanders at the end of the Middle Ages is much higher than it was in the 13th or the 14th century. The power of lords increased, the number of lords increased rather than decrease over time, which suggests to me that lordship is not a medieval impediment to the rise of modern states. In fact, lordship may have been very instrumental to the rise of states. Of course, we need to investigate whether the pattern also holds for societies in late medieval Europe that were very different than Flanders, and for that reason we're going to focus on 5 case studies. For the Low Countries, we investigate Flanders and Guelders. For France, we focus on Normandy and the Languedoc. And for England, we focus on the county of Warwickshire. What is the methodology? The first step is that for each of these 5 regions, we developed 3 snapshot surveys of all the lordships we can find and their owners in the 14th, 15th and 16th century, which should allow us to measure whether, with the passing of time, the number of lords increased, decreased, or remained stable over time. The second step then is to compare the trajectories of 5 different regions, as they all have very different characteristics. First, these 5 regions cover 3 types of states. Warwickshire in England is a proxy for the very old and very centralized English state, which already emerged in the 9th and 10th centuries, which was so centralized early on that it may have avoided decentralizing power in the late Middle Ages. The French state then only emerged much later, in the 13th and 14th century, for large part an era of crisis, think of the 100 Years' War and stuff like that. And we know that French kings had to barter a lot with power elites to gain their support. And the Low Countries then, with Flanders and Guelders, represent a late type of state formation which only takes shape in the 15th and early 16th century. Again, the political and economic climate was then very different from that of the 13th or 14th century, and this may have impinged in significant ways on how states take shape. The next factor that must be investigated is the 2 types of urbanization, which also may have shaped the nature of emerging states. And for this, a comparison between the Languedoc and Flanders is very helpful, because both regions were heavily urbanized, but urbanized in very different ways. The towns of the Languedoc were very coercion-oriented. That is, they all had private militias that terrorized the local countryside. They used force, they used violence to defend their interests, also vis-à-vis nearby lords. Flemish towns then were predominantly market-oriented, that these towns were predominantly centers of trade and industry, and they tended to defend their interests vis-à-vis lords, rather by buying them out, rather than opposing them in a military fashion. The third variable of the project that we need to test is a rural society. There are 2 types of rural society in the 15th and 16th centuries, which may have had a very different impact on the rise of the state. On the one hand, we have regions such as Normandy, where the local peasantry was very strongly organized against local lords, and those local lords were often forced to seek support from the state to defend themselves against the peasantry. In contrast, Warwickshire and Guelders present us with regions in which the position of peasants became increasingly weak, and where lords were perhaps not so much prone to barter with the state for support against the local peasantry. The central idea of the project is that this analytical grid covers the basic topologies of political and economic organization of late medieval Europe, and it should help us to understand how different societies give birth to very different types of state. The idea is that future research can test this model for other regions than the 5 that are central to the project. So much for the high gain. That's what we hope to gain. Of course, high risk. There's also the high risk component. What's the big problem with a project like this? That is, it's very difficult to build up a comparative framework. The Low Countries, France and England are very different societies in many respects. Comparative analysis is not easy by definition. So what is the first preliminary step? At the moment I'm developing a preliminary comparative analysis by focusing on 3 noblemen, an English nobleman, a Flemish nobleman and a French nobleman, who each left us with very complex documents about their own lives and their own social status. These are typical literary projects in self-fashioning, which to a large extent revolve around lordship as a source of nobility, as a source of chivalry, as a source of authority vis-à-vis the state, and so on. I'm not going to go in details, my time is almost up, but the idea is here that I want to test A, the comparative framework of the entire project, and B, I'm aiming for kind of a spillover effect of the project towards my colleagues in the literary studies department. My project is very much a very classic social and political analysis of the interaction between lords and the states in Western Europe. But there are some recent experiments by literary scholars who are very much interested in the way how, in the Ancien regime, late medieval elites construct their own identity, perform their own identity, by developing narratives, textual narratives about self, status, and lordship. And that's something that interests me. That's a bridge the project also hopes to make. Time to wrap up. Skip the example. What are the historiographical stakes? Why is the project important? First, it will provide us with a critical test of a very deep-rooted assumption in the field, that is that state formation is simply centralization. If I'm right, and I may be right, then state formation in Western Europe relied much more on decentralization than currently thought, and thus may resemble much more state formation in Central Europe or Eastern Europe, something that is really not in the picture from current scholarship. Secondly, the project may help to explain why states emerged in the first place. A problem that historians fail to resolve to this day is why thousands of noblemen and bourgeois supported the rise of the state, which was not always in their best interest. Only a small minority of them took positions at court or in the army and so on. If the support of the bourgeoisie and the nobility was paid off with creating new lordships, then the broad social support to the rise of the state among elites does become understandable. And the last but not least, the project shifts the focus from state formation from the national level, the regional level, to the local level. As the example of the poor guy who was burned alive for sodomy in Hansbeek shows, the rise of the state produced very paradoxical results in the sense that local elites gained in power over local villagers rather than they lost power to the central administration. So what state formation meant for people on the ground, the ordinary villagers and so on, that's something that this project also hopes to bring into closer focus. I've spoken enough. Thank you for your kind attention.
It's just a suggestion. You might want to spill over to the colleagues of the African Studies Department as well, because this question of centralization, decentralization was quite central to our Congo-King project, and I'm surprised to hear that in the same time period the processes, ongoing processes, are so similar for Western Europe and this part, at least this part of Central Africa.
I must make a confession, I stole a lot of my ideas when I wrote a proposal from the Africans, so especially like Evans, Richard and so on. So it's not a coincidence that you see similarities in the field of research. Guilty as charged. The problem for me was not to define the problem, and we know that this the problem of decentralization is 70 years old. I mean, we already have in the 1930s fierce critiques of the Weberian idea of state formation equals centralization. But most of those scholars were Nazis, so nobody touched it for 50 years. And the second problem is, how do you measure it? And that was my pitch to the ERC. We know this is a problem for 70 years, we need to solve it, finally, at last. Let me count these lordships, very Game of Thrones-like, and see what happens. So. Thank you.